Imagine waking up one morning as a Roman citizen and realizing the empire that ruled the world no longer feels invincible. The roads still stretch for thousands of miles, the legions still march, the emperor still wears gold, but something is wrong. History books often tell us Rome fell because of barbarian invasions, but that's only the final chapter, not the real story. Because empires don't collapse in a single battle, they collapse quietly, slowly, from the inside. At its height, the Roman Empire controlled nearly a quarter of the world's population. Its laws shaped modern governments. Its engineering still stands 2,000 years later. Rome wasn't just a civilization, it was a system so powerful that people believed it would last forever. So how did something so strong fall apart? What if the real enemies of Rome weren't outside its borders, but sitting inside its palaces? Behind the marble statues and grand arenas were leaders buying loyalty with gold, soldiers fighting for pay instead of purpose, and citizens distracted by endless entertainment. While Rome celebrated victories in public, it was losing discipline, unity, and identity in private. Coins were shrinking, trust was disappearing, the army was changing sides, and ordinary Romans were taxed into poverty to fund a system that no longer protected them. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Rome didn't fall when barbarians entered the city. Rome fell when its people stopped believing in it. The empire survived invasions, plagues, and civil wars before. What it couldn't survive was corruption without accountability, power without responsibility, and comfort without sacrifice. And this is why Rome still matters. Because the warning signs of Rome's collapse didn't look like the end of the world. They looked like success, luxury, stability, normal life continuing, until suddenly it wasn't. In this video, we're uncovering 7 unheard truths behind the fall of the Roman Empire, stories rarely told in classrooms, but deeply relevant today. From economic decay to military betrayal, from political chaos to cultural erosion, each chapter reveals how the greatest empire in history dismantled itself piece by piece. So before you think Rome is just ancient history, ask yourself this. If the most powerful empire the world had ever seen could collapse, what does that mean for us? Stay with me, because Rome's fall is more than a story of the past. It's a warning echoing into the present. Chapter 1. Rome did not fall in a single day. There was no final trumpet heard across the empire, no moment when every citizen woke up and said, "Rome is finished." Instead, Rome faded. Like a giant tree rotting from the inside, it stood tall long after its core was hollow. By the time it finally collapsed, most people living within the empire had already adapted to decline without realizing what they had lost. This is the most dangerous kind of fall, the one no one notices. The illusion of an eternal empire. For centuries, Rome believed it was eternal. Roman writers called the city Roma Eterna, the eternal city. Its roads connected continents, its laws governed millions, its armies had no equal. If a threat appeared, Rome crushed it. To the average Roman citizen, collapse was unthinkable. Empires fell elsewhere, but not Rome. And that belief became Rome's first weakness. Because when people believe something cannot fall, they stop protecting it. A crisis hidden by continuity. From the outside, Rome looked stable. Emperors came and went, but life continued. Markets opened every morning, taxes were collected, soldiers marched, games filled the arenas. But beneath the surface, something had changed. Rome had stopped solving problems. It had started managing decline. Every generation faced slightly higher taxes, weaker leadership, slower trade, more corruption, but each change was small enough to tolerate. No single generation felt the full collapse. That is why no revolution came to save Rome. The turning point no one recognized. Historians often search for a dramatic beginning. Was it the assassination of Julius Caesar, the reign of Nero, the barbarian invasions? But Rome's decline began not with violence, it began with overexpansion. Rome conquered too much, too fast. At its height, the empire stretched from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the Middle East. Managing this vast territory required endless money, soldiers, and bureaucracy, and Rome was forced to make compromises. Borders were stretched thin. Governors were given more autonomy. Local corruption was tolerated to keep order. Each compromise weakened central authority. Rome still ruled, but no longer controlled. From republic to empire, a silent shift. Rome once thrived as a republic. Power was shared. Leaders were accountable. Citizens believed they had a stake in Rome's future. But empire changed everything. As emperors replaced elected officials, citizens slowly lost political responsibility. Decisions were no longer theirs to influence. Survival mattered more than participation. When people stop feeling responsible for their state, decay begins quietly. Rome became something people lived under, not something they built together. Normalization of decline. Perhaps the most tragic part of Rome's fall is this: people adapted. When roads deteriorated, people traveled less. When coins lost value, people bartered. When local security vanished, people relied on private guards. Each adaptation made Rome less necessary. The empire wasn't overthrown, it was slowly bypassed. Citizens no longer asked Rome for protection or justice. They created alternatives. And once an empire becomes optional, its end is only a matter of time. Warnings ignored by the powerful. Some Romans did see the danger. Philosophers warned about moral decay. Economists warned about inflation. Military leaders warned about weakening borders. But power silences inconvenient truths. Admitting decline would mean reform. Reform would threaten elites. So warnings were ignored. It is easier for rulers to deny collapse than to prevent it. The empire that outlived its strength. Rome survived long after it should have collapsed. That survival created the illusion of strength. But strength without resilience is deception. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Rome was no longer leading the world, it was reacting to it. Always late, always defensive, always improvising. Collapse had already happened in slow motion. The final fall was just paperwork. The most dangerous collapse of all. Rome teaches us a lesson history repeats again and again. Civilizations rarely fall from sudden attack. They fall from gradual neglect. They fall when corruption becomes routine, when comfort replaces responsibility, when leaders manage symptoms instead of causes. Rome didn't fall overnight, and that is exactly why no one stopped it. Chapter 3: The Army That Turned Against Rome, When Soldiers Chose Gold Over Loyalty. Rome was built by soldiers. From its earliest days, the Roman army was more than a fighting force. It was the backbone of the state. Soldiers carved roads through mountains, guarded borders, enforced law, and spread Roman culture across the known world. For centuries, the army was loyal not to individuals, but to Rome itself. and when that loyalty died, the empire followed. From citizen soldiers to professional warriors. In the early Republic, Roman soldiers were citizens first. They farmed their own land. They fought when called. They returned home when wars ended. Service was temporary, and loyalty came naturally because Rome was theirs. But expansion changed everything. Campaigns grew longer. Borders became permanent. Soldiers were needed year-round. Rome created a professional army. Professionalism brought efficiency, but also danger. Soldiers no longer fought to defend their homes. They fought for pay. Pay replaces patriotism. Once soldiers depended on the army for survival, loyalty shifted. The state promised wages, land, and retirement. But over time, Rome struggled to keep those promises. Inflation reduced pay. Corruption delayed benefits. Veterans were forgotten. Commanders stepped in. Generals paid soldiers directly. They rewarded loyalty personally. Soldiers followed the man who fed them, not the distant empire that failed them. Rome created an army that belonged to its generals. The birth of military politics. By the late Republic, armies were choosing leaders. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon not because Rome demanded it, but because his soldiers followed him. This moment changed everything. Force replaced law. Armies became political tools. Loyalty became transactional. Every emperor after this ruled at the pleasure of soldiers. The Praetorian Guard, protectors or kingmakers. Nowhere was this corruption clearer than the Praetorian Guard. Originally elite bodyguards, they became power brokers. They assassinated emperors. They sold the throne to the highest bidder. One emperor lasted 9 weeks. Stability vanished. Rome had armies, but no control over them. Civil wars without end. The empire became trapped in endless civil wars. Generals fought generals. Armies destroyed Roman cities. Resources were wasted fighting fellow Romans instead of enemies. Every civil war weakened borders. Rome was bleeding itself dry. Mercenaries and the loss of identity. As Roman citizens avoided military service, Rome turned to foreigners, Germanic warriors, Goths, Franks. They fought bravely, but for money, not Rome. Many kept their own leaders, customs, and loyalties. Rome no longer had a Roman army. It had hired muscle. When soldiers abandoned the empire. By the 4th and 5th centuries, soldiers were stationed but unpaid. Some deserted, others switched sides. Entire units surrendered cities in exchange for gold or land. Defending Rome was no longer worth dying for. The empire still existed, but its shield was gone. The Battle of Adrianople, a warning ignored. In 378 AD, Rome faced disaster. The Gothic army crushed Roman legions. An emperor died on the battlefield. It was a turning point. Rome was no longer militarily superior, but instead of reform, Rome doubled down on hiring barbarians. A fatal mistake. The army without a cause. Rome still had soldiers, still had weapons, still had forts, but it no longer had belief. An army fights hardest when it believes in what it protects. Rome failed to give its soldiers a reason to care. The final betrayal. When Rome was sacked in 410 AD, many defenders simply stepped aside. The city that once ruled the world fell without a last stand. not because Rome lacked soldiers, but because soldiers no longer belonged to Rome. Chapter 4: Bread, Circuses, and Decay. How Comfort Weakened a Superpower. Rome did not collapse because its people were starving. It collapsed because they were comfortable. This is one of history's most uncomfortable truths. Rome did not fall while its citizens were demanding reform. It fell while they were being entertained. The policy that changed everything. The phrase bread and circuses was not metaphorical. It was government policy. To prevent unrest in a massive, unequal empire, Roman leaders chose distraction over reform. Free grain was distributed to hundreds of thousands of citizens. Public spectacles were staged year-round: gladiator games, chariot races, mock sea battles. The message was clear. As long as the people were fed and entertained, they would not question power. For a time, it worked. Early Romans were participants in the state. They voted, served in the army, took pride in public duty. Political engagement was not optional, it was identity. But comfort changed behavior. When survival no longer required effort, responsibility faded. Citizens stopped asking how Rome was governed. They only asked what Rome would give them next. And population that once built an empire learned how to watch it instead. Entertainment without limit. Rome did not ration distraction. Games expanded in scale and violence. Gladiators fought to the death. Animals were slaughtered by the thousands. Executions became public spectacle. Crowds demanded more blood, more drama, more shock. As moral standards declined, leaders competed to impress, not govern. Entertainment replaced meaning. The cost of constant pleasure. Nothing in Rome was free. Grain distributions required massive logistics. Games cost enormous sums. Amphitheaters had to be built, staffed, and maintained. To pay for it all, taxes increased. Provinces were squeezed harder. Corruption deepened. Rome was financing pleasure with its future. Luxury and moral erosion. As wealth concentrated, elites lived in excess. Banquets lasted for days. Villas expanded while cities decayed. Status replaced service. Luxury disconnected the ruling class from reality. They no longer experienced the consequences of their decisions. Empires rot fastest at the top. Escaping responsibility. Entertainment became more than distraction. It became escape. Citizens knew the empire was weakening. They saw corruption. They felt economic pressure. But games offered temporary relief. Why protest when tomorrow brings another spectacle? Distraction doesn't erase problems. It delays reaction until it's too late. The decline of civic virtue. Rome once celebrated discipline, sacrifice, and duty. By the late empire, these values were mocked. Service became a burden. Courage became unnecessary. Honor became outdated. The state no longer produced citizens willing to defend it. Comfort breeds dependency, and dependency destroys resilience. An empire addicted to applause. Emperors measured success by crowd reaction. Popularity mattered more than policy. Short-term approval outweighed long-term stability. This is the trap of mass distraction. Leaders stop leading and start performing. Rome became a stage, and the empire became a prop. When crisis finally arrived. When invasions came, Rome was unprepared, not militarily, but psychologically. Citizens expected protection without participation. They expected comfort during chaos. They had forgotten how to sacrifice. The silent trade. Rome traded freedom for food,
responsibility for entertainment, strength for comfort. And once traded away, these qualities could not be reclaimed.
Chapter 5: Economic Collapse, Inflation, Taxes, and the Death of Roman Trade. Rome did not fall when its armies lost battles. It fell when its economy stopped working. Empires can survive bad rulers. They can survive weak borders. They can even survive corruption for a time. But no empire survives the collapse of its economy. When money loses meaning, when trade disappears, when work no longer leads to security, the foundation of civilization begins to crack. That is exactly what happened to Rome, slowly, quietly, and then all at once. The engine that once powered the world. At its height, Rome ran the most advanced economy the ancient world had ever seen. Roads connected continents, ports bustled with ships, markets overflowed with goods from Africa, Asia, and Europe. Roman coins were trusted across borders. Merchants could plan for the future. The Roman economy was not just wealthy, it was predictable. And predictability is everything. Endless war, endless cost. But empire is expensive. Legions had to be paid year-round, fortifications maintained, bureaucracies expanded, grain shipped across seas, games funded, bribes paid. As expansion slowed, Rome stopped gaining new wealth from conquest, but expenses never stopped rising. The empire began spending more than it earned. And like all governments facing this reality, Rome chose the easiest solution: the slow poison of inflation. Rome debased its currency. Silver coins were mixed with cheaper metals. Gold coins shrank in weight. Officially, the coins were worth the same, but everyone noticed. Prices rose, trust fell. Merchants charged more, soldiers demanded higher pay, savings lost value. Inflation is invisible at first, but once it begins, it feeds on itself. Rome unleashed a force it could not control. When money stops being trusted. A currency works only because people believe in it. Once belief fades, money becomes metal. By the 3rd century, Roman coins varied wildly in quality. People hoarded older coins and rejected new ones. Barter returned. Trade slowed, markets fractured, long-distance commerce became risky. An empire without trade becomes a collection of isolated regions. The tax trap. As inflation reduced purchasing power, the state raised taxes, then raised them again and again. Farmers were taxed whether crops failed or not. Merchants paid fees at every checkpoint. Cities were assigned impossible quotas. Tax collectors enforced payment brutally. Many citizens fled land rather than pay. The death of the middle class. The Roman middle class was the empire's backbone. Farmers, artisans, traders, people who worked, paid taxes, and maintained stability. They were crushed. The rich avoided taxes through influence. The poor had nothing to take. The burden fell on those in between. As the middle class vanished, so did Rome's stability. From free citizens to bound labor. To stop economic collapse, Rome made a desperate move. People were legally bound to professions. Farmers could not leave land. Sons inherited obligations. Workers became tied to employers. What began as emergency control became permanent. Freedom disappeared quietly. Rome had stabilized its economy, but at the cost of its soul. Trade routes fall silent. As insecurity grew, roads decayed. Bandits roamed, borders collapsed,
ports emptied. Trade that once linked the empire dried up. Cities shrank, craftsmanship declined, self-sufficiency replaced specialization. Rome no longer functioned as a single economic system. The illusion of control. The government responded with more laws, price controls, wage caps, trade restrictions. They failed. You cannot legislate prosperity. Black markets thrived, corruption exploded, officials enforced rules selectively. Control replaced competence. An empire running on extraction. Rome no longer created wealth, it extracted it. Provinces were drained, cities stripped, future productivity sacrificed for present survival. This is the final stage of economic decline. Why recovery was impossible. Economic collapse fed every other failure. Unpaid soldiers rebelled, corruption increased, loyalty vanished, infrastructure crumbled. Rome was trapped. Fixing the economy required stability. Stability required loyalty. Loyalty required trust, and trust was gone. The quiet end of Roman prosperity. There was no announcement, no official declaration. Markets simply closed. Coins disappeared. Cities emptied. The Roman economy didn't crash, it faded away.
Chapter 6. Barbarians at the Gates or Invited In? Rome's Deadly Mistake. Rome did not fall because barbarians broke down its gates. Rome fell because it opened them. This is one of history's greatest ironies and one of its clearest warnings. The outsiders who ultimately ruled Roman lands were not always enemies. Many arrived as refugees, others as allies, some as soldiers sworn to defend the empire. They were invited in by Rome itself, and once inside, they never truly left. Who were the barbarians? To the Romans, the word barbarian did not mean savage. It meant foreign. Goths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons, Huns, these were organized societies with leaders, laws, and cultures of their own. Many admired Rome. Many wanted to join it. They traded with Romans, served in Roman armies, adopted Roman customs. Rome did not face an alien world. It faced neighbors. But Rome treated them as tools, not partners. Pressure beyond the borders. By the 4th century, Rome's borders were under constant pressure. Population movements swept across Europe. Climate shifts, famine, and warfare, especially the rise of the Huns, pushed entire tribes toward Roman territory. These were not small raiding parties, they were nations on the move. Rome could no longer stop them all. So it made a choice, the fatal compromise. Instead of fighting endlessly, Rome negotiated. Barbarian groups were allowed to settle within imperial borders in exchange for military service. They would farm Roman land, defend Roman territory, and follow Roman law. On paper, it was brilliant. Rome gained soldiers without recruitment costs, borders gained defenders, the economy gained labor. In reality, Rome had surrendered control. The Gothic refugees. The most famous example came in 376 AD. Tens of thousands of Goths arrived at the Danube, fleeing the Huns. They begged Rome for refuge. Rome agreed, but corruption turned mercy into disaster. Officials starved the Goths, sold food at extortionate prices, and abused them openly. Children were sold into slavery for scraps of meat. Rome did not integrate the Goths, it humiliated them. From refugees to rebels. Starvation led to revolt. The Goths rose up, not as invaders, but as betrayed allies. 2 years later, Rome faced them in battle. At Adrianople in 378 AD, the Roman army was annihilated. The emperor was killed. The myth of Roman superiority died on that field. Rome had armed its future enemies. Barbarians inside the system. Despite the disaster, Rome continued the policy. Barbarians were settled across the empire.
Entire regions were handed over for defense. They kept their own leaders, their own laws, their own loyalties. Rome no longer ruled these lands, it outsourced them. The illusion of control. Roman officials convinced themselves this was manageable. After all, these groups needed Roman legitimacy, Roman titles, Roman gold. But dependency ran both ways. As Rome weakened, barbarian leaders gained leverage. They demanded land, rank, and autonomy, and Rome had no strength left to refuse. The sack of Rome, a shock, not a surprise. In 410 AD, the unimaginable happened. Rome was sacked. The city that had not fallen to foreign enemies in 800 years was looted by Gothic forces, many of whom had once served Rome. The world was stunned, but the truth was simpler. Rome had lost the loyalty of those it relied on. A state without borders. By the 5th century, Rome's borders existed mostly on maps. Defense was regional, authority was fragmented. Barbarian kings ruled Roman provinces in all but name. Rome still had emperors, but they commanded little. Why Rome couldn't reverse course. Rome could not expel these groups. It lacked the army. It lacked the money. It lacked the unity. The empire had crossed a point of no return. Integration requires strength. Rome integrated from weakness. The final illusion. For decades, Roman emperors told themselves they still ruled. Laws were issued, titles granted, ceremonies held. But power had shifted. Rome did not collapse in battle. It faded into irrelevance. The real mistake. Rome's mistake was not compassion. It was losing control of who enforced its authority. An empire can survive outsiders. It cannot survive surrendering sovereignty.
Chapter 7. The Final Echo. Why Rome's Fall Still Warns the Modern World. Rome did not disappear. That is the greatest misunderstanding of all. It did not vanish in fire or dust. It did not end with a single defeat or a final emperor dragged from a throne. Rome dissolved, slowly, into something else. And that is precisely why its fall still matters. Because Rome's collapse did not belong to the ancient world alone. It belongs to every civilization that believes it is immune to history. The illusion of uniqueness. Every powerful society believes it is different. Rome believed its laws were superior, its armies unbeatable, its system eternal. Modern civilizations believe the same, just with different words. Technology replaces legions. Currency replaces tribute, media replaces amphitheaters, but the psychology remains unchanged. When power feels permanent, vigilance fades. What Rome really lost. Rome did not lose territory first, it lost trust. Trust in leadership, trust in institutions, trust that effort would be rewarded and loyalty protected. When citizens stop believing the system works for them, they stop defending it. That truth has no expiration date. Collapse is a process, not an event. Rome teaches us something uncomfortable. Civilizations don't fall because people don't see the danger. They fall because people see it, but normalize it. Higher taxes become routine. Corruption becomes expected. Distraction becomes constant. Decline becomes familiar. And familiarity is deadly. The quiet death of civic responsibility. Rome did not collapse when people became evil. It collapsed when people became indifferent. When public duty feels pointless, citizens withdraw. When participation feels meaningless, apathy replaces resistance. Rome's people did not rebel, they adapted. And adaptation without reform accelerates decay. When elites disconnect from reality. Rome's ruling class insulated itself from consequences. While cities decayed, elites feasted. While soldiers went unpaid, officials grew rich. While provinces burned, ceremonies continued. Power survived, but legitimacy did not. No civilization survives that divide for long. The army, the state, and the breaking point. Rome's final failure was surrendering the monopoly of force. Once soldiers served gold instead of principle, the state became optional. No law matters without enforcement. No empire exists without loyalty. Rome learned this too late. Borders, identity, and authority. Rome did not fail because it encountered outsiders. It failed because it no longer defined who held authority. When borders become negotiable and enforcement becomes outsourced, sovereignty erodes quietly. Empires do not die when people arrive. They die when rules stop applying equally. Economic reality always wins. Rome ignored economic fundamentals. It debased money, crushed productivity, punished the middle class, extracted instead of created wealth. No amount of ideology can defeat arithmetic. Eventually, reality collects its debt. The most dangerous moment in any civilization. The most dangerous moment is not crisis, it is false stability. When systems still function, but barely. When life feels normal, but weaker. When leaders promise continuity instead of change. Rome lived in false stability for generations, and by the time collapse felt real, it was irreversible. Why Rome still speaks to us. Rome's fall is not a prophecy, it is a pattern, a warning that power must be renewed, not inherited, that legitimacy must be earned, not enforced, that strength requires sacrifice, not comfort alone. History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes relentlessly. The final truth. Rome was not destroyed by barbarians. It was dismantled by choices. Small choices, repeated choices, comfortable choices. And that is why Rome matters. Because its fall asks every civilization the same question. What are you slowly accepting that you should be fixing? Epilogue. The empire that never ended. Rome fell, but its shadow remains. In law, in language, in power structures, in ambition. Rome lives on not as a warning of violence, but as a reminder of neglect. The empire did not die screaming. It faded while everyone was distracted.
Rome did not fall in flames. It faded in silence. There was no single moment when the world stopped and said, "This is the end." Instead, life went on, markets opened, soldiers marched, crowds filled the arenas, and while people were distracted by the familiar, something irreplaceable was slipping away. Rome did not lose its power first, it lost its purpose. It lost the belief that the empire belonged to its people, and that the people belonged to something greater than comfort, entertainment, or survival. For generations, Romans told themselves that tomorrow would be better, that decline was temporary, that someone else would fix it, and in that waiting, responsibility vanished. Empires do not die when they are attacked, they die when they stop caring. Rome's greatest tragedy was not invasion, corruption, or even collapse. It was indifference. When injustice became normal, when corruption became expected, when distraction replaced participation. The fall of Rome was not loud enough to wake the people living through it, but history heard it clearly, and it still echoes. Because Rome's story is not about the past, it is about patterns, about how power creates comfort, and comfort erodes vigilance, about how strong systems decay when citizens become spectators, about how freedom fades not through force, but through neglect. Rome believed it was eternal. Every civilization does. But eternity is not guaranteed by strength, wealth, or influence. It is preserved by responsibility, accountability, and the courage to confront decline before it becomes collapse. Rome did not fall overnight, and neither do modern societies. They weaken slowly, quietly, comfortably, until one day they realize too late that the foundations they depended on were never maintained. The lesson of Rome is not fear,
It is awareness, because the moment people stop asking hard questions, stop demanding better leadership, and stop caring about the future, history begins preparing its next lesson. Rome forgot itself, and history is still watching to see who forgets next.